Welcome to Rome. This is The Bittersweet Life with Katy Sewell and Tiffany Parks. Hello, this is The Bittersweet Life. I'm Katy Sewell. Today, a special episode of the show recorded live at Town Hall in Seattle, where I had the pleasure of talking to Edward Burns on September 25th last year. Edward Burns has made 14 feature films as a writer, director, actor, and has starred in many films, including Saving Private Ryan and his very first movie, The Brothers McMullen, which premiered at the 1995 Sundance Film Festival, winning the Grand Jury Prize. The film also won Best First Feature at the 1996 Independent Spirit Awards. If you look him up, I am sure you will recognize him, and I'm also sure that you will recognize the sound of his voice. It is very recognizable. I met him at Town Hall in Seattle to talk about his very first novel, titled A Kid from Marlboro Road, based on his childhood memories and the Irish-Ameican communities of the Bronx and Long Island. I loved spending time with him. He is a great storyteller, and many themes in the conversation that you are about to hear shaped my thinking for weeks to come. I hope you enjoy.
Guys, how are you? How you doing?
All right, so we are going to talk a little bit about the movie industry, but I want to go hard on the book because you don't get to write a book every day.
No.
So I want to start with talking about character voice. So this book is written from the perspective of a 12-year-old boy, and I really feel like you capture not only the sound of a younger voice, but the way that they would observe the world. I actually wrote an example of your voice down. Great. This starts with his mother talking. She says, "But you have your own radio in your own room. Listen to Jean Shepherd in there," she tells me. But she doesn't understand that it's more fun to listen with her so that we can laugh together and talk about the parts of the story we liked best. It very much feels like a younger kid is telling us this story. So I was wondering, how do you approach voice in your writing? I mean, you can take it for screen or for books, but either way.
Yeah, so, I'll start with screenplays and then I'll get to specifically to this. It's when writing dialogue, I always kind of speak it out loud. It's almost like it should have like sort of, it should feel like lyrics. I try to find the characters have like a lyrical like cadence to the speech. So that's something I do. And then my longtime producing partner, whose name will probably come up a few times tonight, this guy, Aaron Lubin, been working together for 25 years. When I finish a draft of a script, he and I will then read it out loud. And we'll play the different parts, and that is so that I can just, and he's not an actor, and he doesn't try to act, but, I'm just trying to hear, do the voices sound authentic? Does it sound like the way people speak? And so I'm just going to apologize now. I have a little bit of like ADHD, so I'm going to bounce around all over the place. And please remind me to get back to what the hell we're talking about. But
about voice.
That's just how my brain works, because that just triggered a thought, which has now gone. All right, so... but anyhow, I'll just focus on the book then.
You're reading out loud.
Reading out loud. Oh, yeah. Just when I made my first film, The Brothers McMullen, the reason I wanted to make that film, one of the initial reasons was that I was 23 when I wrote the script. Whatever movies were coming out in the early 90s about like the Gen X kids, I didn't think they sounded authentic. They did not sound like real kids who were either, from 19 to 25, the way I thought me and my friends spoke. My ear was always attuned to how people speak and does that sound honest. So to this kid, the 12-year-old, I wrote this book during COVID. At that time when we were sort of sequestered away in our house, my son was 14. So he had just kind of moved through the chapter that the protagonist in this book is going through. I coached my son's AAU basketball team for years, so I spent a lot of time in an SUV with 6, 12, and 13-year-old kids, 3 hours into upstate New York, listening to them BS in the backseat of the car. And, they're at that age where, they're still little kids, but they're taking that step towards feeling it out a little bit, so... A lot of that was helpful to have their voices in my head as I started to create this character.
But then, of course, you have to translate the kids of today to like the kids of the 60s.
Yeah. Well, I knew, I'm sure a lot of people, I can remember amazing details about my childhood, and I can't remember where I was yesterday. So for whatever reason, like, it's a beautiful thing that happens when you're either writing a screenplay or, in this case, writing the book. Like when you just sort of like surrender to the process. And I typically write every day. I try to write anywhere between 3 to 5 hours. I have days where it's like really going well and I'll just quickly eat something and I know like I'm in a groove and I want to go back for another 2 hours just because I like being in sort of the fantasy world, if you will. The characters will take you on a journey. So with the case of this kid, I had some ideas of what I wanted to explore, but all of these memories from my childhood just kept popping kept popping out of my subconscious mind and onto the page that I had forgotten about. So
that's great. Well, so since we were talking about screenwriting also, this is your first novel. What was the difference in how you approached it?
The big difference was I had not written any form of prose since my senior year of high school. And, that I will get to that story. I was one of those kids who was blessed by having a teacher who kind of singled me out and said, this is what you should do. Her name was Miss Maxwell. And I was a disinterested student, I should say. I wasn't a dummy, but I was completely apathetic about school and grades and things like that. And my senior year of high school, I have like a creative writing class, and I write this short story. She hands me the paper back during class, and I get an A+, and she goes, I want to talk to you after class. So I assume that I'm in trouble, because anytime a teacher has to talk to you, specifically me, I was probably in trouble, which is another story that's in the book when I win the Catholic Daughters of America poetry contest. We got to get to that. But anyhow, Miss Maxwell, afterwards, she says, what do you want to do next year, like when you go to college? Do you have any idea? And I had no clue. I didn't give it any thought. And that's what I said. And she goes, you need to do this. This is what you need to do. You can write. Sometimes in your life, you're just lucky enough to have someone like that who, I did one of these maybe last week at a place in Santa Monica, a bookstore called Godmothers. They call it Godmothers because it's like they're paying homage to the women in your life that water and nurture the seed, right? And I had Miss Maxwell. And so much so that, after that, I became an English major in college. And then 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Independent Ed, which was like a how-to in the indie film business. At that time, I think I'd made 11 movies. No two were financed the same way. No two were made the same way. No two had the same distribution deal. So it was sort of like for kids coming out of film school, like there is no one path to sort of pursue or chase your dream. But the opening chapter of that book was called Thank You, Miss Maxwell. And it tells the story. And the story is kind of interesting because that short story, later on in the school year, she says, Edward, at the end of the year, we do this magazine that will, for all the kids who are into the arts, the watercolors and the photographers and the poets, and I'd love to include your short story. And I said, absolutely not. You're not putting, and that's kind of, I got to tell the other part of the story first to give you an explanation. When I win this all right, when I'm in the 6th grade, this is in the book. Can I keep rambling like this?
Please do.
It's a problem. I'm sorry, guys. You can imagine what my poor wife finished the effing story already. So I'm in the 6th grade, a Catholic school. You have to write a poem as an assignment. It had to be about Jesus because it was Catholic school. I write this poem about Jesus. I don't think anything of it. I hand it in. I get called down to the principal's office, Sister Paul Francis. Again, I assume I'm in trouble. She says, I want to talk to you about the poem. I'm like, what did I say in the poem? She goes, we love the poem and we want to submit it to the Catholic Daughters of America poetry contest. Now, who knew that this existed? Of course, I did not want to participate, but I had no choice. They hand in the poem, and the poem wins first place for Nassau County on Long Island. All right. So, this is 1977. I come from a real working class neighborhood. So like a couple of terrible things happened after winning that. I got a trophy that was bigger than any sports trophy I had gotten. So that immediately got tucked into the closet so none of my friends could see it because I knew the ridicule that would follow. Because at school, if you read poetry, wrote poetry, won poetry contests, it was a surefire way to kind of get your ass kicked in the hallway, which happened. So the one beautiful thing, though, that came from that was my father, who was a New York City police officer, like a working class guy. he went the opposite way that in the movies you would think the working class dad would be when the kid wins a poetry contest. He's like, Edward, you are not taking the cop test when you're 19. You are going to be a writer. So he was the other godmother in my life, if you will. So thinking back to, walking down the hallway of St. Joseph's and the older kids, getting me in headlocks and giving me dead legs and purple nurples for being a poet, when Miss Maxwell brings this up, I'm like, no, thank you. However, if you want to publish it, why don't you put it in there without my name on it? We'll just say author unknown. She says, fine. Agreed. All right? So that's what we do. Last week of school, all of a sudden, a couple of girls come up to me and like, oh my God, Eddie, I had no idea you were so sensitive. I'm like, what are you talking about? They're like the short story about the old man. I was like, what? And then they show me, Miss Maxwell, I put my name on it. All right? But that sort of, after that, I was like, oh, maybe there is something to this writing thing. And after that, I was like, I'm going to be a writer. That's just what I'm going to do. But then I go to school. I go as an English major. Again, not a great student, not paying enough attention, close to being put on academic probation. If you're an English major at my school, you can become a film studies minor. Mm-hmm. Watch some old movies, write a paper, get an A, keep your GPA up, stay in school. All right, I'm down with that program. First class I see in one of the first classes is Billy Wilder's The Apartment. And my mind is blown. I went to the movies on a Friday night with my friends. I was never exposed to films like this. That balance of like really dramatic subject matter, right, with the comedy. I was blown away. So after class, I said to the professor, I was like, oh, look, I have a question. You keep talking about Billy Wilder. He's the writer, director. What does that mean? And again, I'm a working class kid from Long Island. I never met anybody in the arts ever. In my community of friends, like, I had never met an adult who went to college other than probably, my teachers, and maybe not all of them. So that I wasn't brought up in that world. And he goes on to explain to me that, well, he has this idea for a movie and he writes the screenplay and then they hire all these people and they come on set and they kind of put on a show. And I'm like, and that's a job that you can have? Like that can be your life to do that. And he's like, yeah. And that movie's, 40 years old. There's plenty of other people who've done it since. Light bulb moment, another godmother. That's what I'm going to do. All right, so that's what I decided to do. And I never look back on writing prose or writing a novel. But my freshman year, when I was an English major, I just assumed I would write a novel one day. So then when I'm also in film school, another film that I see is Truffaut's 400 Blows, which for me is like the ultimate coming-of-age film. And when I see that film in film school, I'm like, okay, that is the movie I'm going to make one day. I'll tell my story of what it was like to be a 12-year-old kid on Long Island. And I thought it was going to be sort of like the movie about like the last generation of latchkey kids. Like I said, all my friends, our parents, everybody worked. So in the summertime, like your parents would leave for work at 7:30 in the morning and they would be home for dinner at 6:30. We didn't go to summer camp. We were in summer programs. We were just like out in the neighborhood doing our thing. And, had a lot of good times and probably got into some trouble and did some stupid stuff. So I thought, all right, my movie will be kind of like Stand By Me without the dead body. All right, that was my thinking. And that's one of the films that I had on my list of movies that I want to make one day. But, from 95 to whenever COVID was, right, 30 years go by and I never sat down to write that script. So then when COVID happens and we're stuck at home, I knew I'd have some time on my hands. I said, now is the time. And also given my son's age, it started to, pop my head a little bit. Yeah. All right, now I'm going to write that screenplay. And then I speak to Aaron Lubin, the guy who reads the scripts with me, my producing partner. And he's like, Eddie, I'm hearing from, our agent and our attorney, I don't know when we're going to be able to make a movie again because, due to social distancing, no one knows when we'll be back on set. So at that point, I was like, well, I don't want to waste my time writing a script that may not get made for a couple of years. And I quite honestly, I can't tell you when the moment was where I said, this should be a novel. But whenever that happened, I start writing it as a novel. But I'm a coward. I don't believe that I can write prose. So I write the first 6 chapters as a journal, right? And I think to your very first question, if we're still on the first question, and I think it's time for the Q&A, right?
I read the whole book. Yeah.
So anyhow, I promise this will be the last one that's crazy long like this. But I write it as a journal, but that's where, because I'm in tune with the kids' voices. But then after 6 chapters, I'm like, this is a cop-out, all right? You can do this. So I kind of, it helped me find the voice, but then I went to writing the novel. And then the other thing that happens, and I will shut up after this, and then we can get to some other stuff. I'll come back to it. Because it's COVID, my parents were trapped down in Florida, couldn't get home to Long Island. So I'm calling my parents every day, just like, what'd you have for dinner? What did you and Dad watch on Netflix last night? Doing that whole thing. And after a week or 2 of that, and my mom wasn't well, I was like, all right, I'm going to just call my mom every day, and I'll ask her a very specific question about her life. What do you remember about the day you graduated high school? What do you remember about your first job in Manhattan? What do you remember about taking the 3rd Avenue L with your father down from the Bronx into Manhattan? What do you remember about when, my dad said he was going to take the cop test? And, so I'm going upstairs after talking to her, thinking I'm writing the book about the 12-year-old latchkey kids, and slowly my mom's stories start sort of working their way into the book. And this book now is really the story of, a fictionalized version of me and my brother and my son dealing with a fictionalized version of my mom who, was probably dealing with some form of depression, although we didn't know what that was back then in 1980. And if we did, we were Catholic, so you swept it under the rug. And my parents it seemed like they had some moments where they weren't getting along the way they used to. So in the book, this kid is terrified that his parents are headed for divorce. And that brings up another funny story I'll tell you, because my dad just recently reread the book for the 3rd time. And I told him when I gave it to him, I said, Dad, this isn't us. All right, it's not 3 kids. It's only 2 kids. All right. Yes, it is our town, and the father is a cop like you were, and the mom was from the Bronx, and her parents were born in Ireland and came over here, and her mother did die, but it's it's definitely not us. And it isn't. But there's a lot of us in there, but it's pieces of it, and I'll explain that later. But anyhow, the old man, my dad, after I told him, he goes, I know this is fiction. I know it's fiction, but I have a question. There's a scene at the end of the book where the kid comes to the dad in the kitchen, and the kid has been wanting to talk to his parents about, are they getting divorced? And he's afraid, he's reluctant to ask either one of them the question. And then finally, at the end, he musters up the courage, and he asks his dad, are you and Mom getting divorced? And the dad looks at him like he's crazy, because they're Catholic, and we don't even talk about divorce. He goes, look, I want to explain to you. A marriage, or maybe our marriage more specifically, is like having a bum leg, okay? Now, divorce would mean, or would be the equivalent of maybe cutting the leg off, all right? So I could cut the leg off, and we could walk around the neighborhood with a peg leg, or your mother and I could just choose to walk with a limp, all right? And that's what we've done. We've chosen to walk with a limp. So no, we're not getting divorced. Now get the F out of the house. And my father says, yeah, I don't remember ever saying that. I was like, yeah, because you didn't, because it's fiction, and I made it up. So to the point, was I terrified as a kid that my parents might get divorced? Yes, at times. Did my father ever have that conversation with me? No. So I'm going to take a drink of water and listen to the next question.
Please do. Oh, man. Okay, I'm going to move on from that. I was going to ask you, why not write it as a memoir in some ways, but let's move on to something, unless you have a great answer.
I'll do a short answer.
Okay.
Because, I had no interest in trying to remember the past and tell it honestly and truthfully. I write fiction. I love writing fiction. I talked about the characters taking you on a journey. And quite honestly, I wasn't as insightful as this kid. You're right. B, my childhood wasn't as interesting as all of that. And I'll tell you some of the stories how I pulled 9 different little snapshots from moments with my mom. and turn that into one sequence. And also, I just thought, the past isn't how we remember it. I come from a multi-generational family of, we would say storytellers or bullshit artists. The joke is I'm just the first one who figured out how to get paid to do it. But, at the dinner table, and then, when we're older, weddings and funerals and in bars, there was competition to be the person who could hold court, who could tell the best, funniest, and obviously longest story. So that's why.
That's great. All right. So because you mentioned that the mother in this book is probably suffering from depression, this is definitely not a sad book, but it is but your character observes a lot of sadness in this book, mostly from his mother, but he also sees it in places in his grandmother and in his father and even in himself. So is there a reason why sadness is one of the central themes that you were dwelling on while you were writing this book?
Probably because, there's certain lines in the book that come from my dad. One, when talking about my mother and also the Irish in general, he said they have no gift for happiness, right? So that was just part of my life. And we never looked at it as sadness. It was just the way it was, right? I'm nostalgic to a fault. I get very melancholy, which is different than sadness. In the book at the end, I think he looks up the definition of melancholy or bittersweet. Yeah, just trying to, and again, that's me, the author, trying to find a word that describes exactly what I go through and what the kid was going through. There's a passage in the book where he and his mom are driving in the car and they're just listening to endless sad songs. Why do we do that to ourselves? And she says, you're so sad. Why do you keep listening to these sad songs over and over? We indulge our sadness, right? And, I've always heard that it's an Irish thing. I'm sure it's an everybody thing. But, yeah, I don't know. I just, the world can the little things can just break your heart, so...
Yeah, I would say that there's 3 themes of sadness. You could riff on any one of the themes.
Okay.
One of them is the sadness at the changing world or the temporary nature of things. That they could be driving in a car and they can remember that there were bars and dance halls and houses and bungalows in these areas, but now they're not there anymore. Yep. So it's in your memory, but it's no longer present. So that's one of the things that they talk about a lot. In particular, your mother character is just ongoing devastated by this.
That was my mom. Definitely. There's a sequence in there about Rockaway Beach. Rockaway was kind of beautiful. They called it the Irish Riviera. Hardly the Riviera, but that was gone. The version of it was gone. They tore down all these little bungalows and they just were empty lots on the beach for years. And we would drive through there. I don't know why, just to reminisce about what was. And I know that, there's 2 passages in the book that, the kid at the end, the last paragraph, he talks about, basically it's there is no permanence, right? And that's terrible and it's sad. And it's the kid recognizes this is what, has crippled my mom from, living in the present. And I know it prevents me from living in the present. And there's a version of me that is the kid, but there's a version of me that's also the mother, because there's a scene in the book where the mom is, the boys are moving, they're the older brother is probably 15, this kid is 12, so they got to get their little kid stuff, their childhood memorabilia, what's the word, whatever it is, the stuff, the kid stuff, off the top shelf. He's a writer, right? The kid stuff. Forget the word, because there's a good song about it that I just heard from a woman whose last name is McKenna. Does anyone know that country artist? Anyhow, see, just keep me focused. Anyhow, so in the book, the mother's standing on the chair, right? And she's taking these things off of the shelf to box them up because it's time for the little boy stuff to be put away in the attic. And in it, she starts crying hysterically on the chair. And the 2 boys sit there silently because they don't know how to react when your mom just starts crying. And then she sits down on the bed in between them, and she's crying hysterically, holding this teddy bear. And that kind of gets us into this story of what happened when the kid got stitches on above his eye. But that is me. When I had to take the little kid stuff off of my son's shelf, I mean, I did not cry in front of my son and then ask him, do you remember when we got this? And why do you want to throw it out? Don't you know how meaningful it is? But like, I was up there like, oh my God, I'm getting a little verklempt. I better get out of here so that my guy doesn't see his father crying for no reason. You know, and there's another scene where after they go for the beach where they take the dog, right? Yeah. There's a scene where the hero of our story comes up behind his father, and puts his arms around his father, and he can feel his father is kind of like shaking, like trying to suppress the tears. Mm-hmm. My old man never cried in front of us. All right, that just didn't. My parents never said, I love you. We didn't have hugs and kisses goodnight. We did not grow up like that. So I never saw my father cry. So the father crying in the book, again, because he knows his boy is going to leave him soon, that's me. Mm-hmm. That said, the story in the book where the father does cry for the first time when they put their dog down, again, like kind of how the book is a little bit fact and a little bit fiction, the first time I did see my father cry was when, I'll give you just a quick little story again. It's in the book, so it's related. So I had a dog, a Pomeranian. I won't get into why I had a Pomeranian. But when I went off to do Saving Private Ryan, I gave the dog to my dad. And he's like, what am I supposed to do with the dog? I'm like, I'm going to be gone for 3 months. Just take care of the dog. He's like, fine. All right. I come back home. He says, you're not getting the dog back. I'm hearing from people that he's going into the bank, into the deli, and he's got the dog in his coat, and he loves the dog. So after that, we have shared custody of this Pomeranian. All right? Then the dog gets sick, and the dog has to be put down. And, at the time, I'm like 29. The scene is described as it happened in 1999, but I used that story for the summer of 1980 with the 12-year-old kid seeing his father cry for the first time. So that kind of is another example of how I used, my history and my family's history and who we were, but fictionalized them.
Yeah. Well, and there's also the rift between a kid in childhood and them becoming a teenager, and the distance that puts between parents.
Yeah.
In writing all that, did it give you a different perspective on your own growing up and leaving of your parents?
I
know you experienced it with your kids.
I experienced
probably.
it with my kids, so it's definitely much more of that. Again, I think my parents' generation, they weren't as attached to us as we are to our children. If anything, I think they were happy to get a effing break, quite honestly. So I don't think they were ever crying or emotional about not seeing us. So no.
Well, then why is your generation so different?
Maybe because of the lack of it. You know what I mean? That's probably it. There's a story that I mentioned in the book that only after hearing this story did I get a better understanding of, let's say, why my mother wasn't as available emotionally, right? So when I'm writing the book, I'm having those phone conversations I told you about my mom. My mom tells me a story. And again, in a house like ours, you heard pieces of all these stories your whole life. And a lot of times when you're the kids, you're not paying attention to the parent's story because you want to tell your story, right? So I knew pieces of it, but I asked her this question. And she told me the story about when her mother died. And basically, so my mom's 2 brothers were born in Ireland. They came over to the South Bronx in 1937. My mother is born in 37. Her younger brother is born in 38. And her mother dies shortly thereafter. All right. Her father was an uneducated immigrant, as my dad said, Patty off the boat, who was also a drunk with 4 kids under the age of 6, no education, and no prospects. So he put all 4 kids in an orphanage and went back to Ireland. Went to Ireland to find a new wife to help him raise these kids. Could not find a new wife. My mom never told me how long they were in the orphanage, but I know there was a lot of back and forth to the orphanage. There was some foster care sprinkled in there. It wasn't something she really wanted to talk about. But he did come back. When he did come back, he got a job working as a sandhog. And the sandhogs were the guys who, when they were building the Lincoln Tunnel, or any of the, underwater tunnels and aqueducts. The, guys go down, they blast out the bedrock, and then there are guys down there who take out the rock. And again, this is in the, late 30s, 40s. So he died at like 62 from black lung disease, from just breathing in all that shit, and also probably consumption. So, but she adored her father. In the book, he's Pop McSweeney. We always knew him as Pop McKenna. He was one of those like gregarious, funny Irish guys who, like, every Sunday night he'd have, this is years later when my father was dating my mom. He said, we'd show up at the apartment as we're coming up the stairs. You could hear them going on in the kitchen. They're dancing, they got the fiddles going and the banjo, and they're singing and they're doing the whole thing. You'd go into the kitchen and my dad would be like, and your mother, of course, like, she's used to this because, like, she's dancing around with them. So it's like, she's Irish. I'm Irish, but I'm not that Irish. So my mom would tell me the stories of, Pop McKenna and his friends and all of that. And she adored him. There's a thing in the book where she was like, and they had this dog, and she would look out the window of the apartment. If the dog was sitting outside of O'Leary's pub, she knew that her father was there. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. She knew, like, all right, I know where he is, but that means everyone else knows where he is. And it's, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the old man is, getting his load on. So she would tell the story that on payday from the Sandhogs, because he was a binge drinker, he would have those times where he knew he was going to just go off on a 2-week bender. He'd get his paycheck. And she told this part of the story from, I said, what do you remember about taking the 3rd Avenue L? Those are the elevated trains that used to exist in New York, and they're gone now. And of course, my mother would, the 3rd Avenue L. We would sit in the L with my girlfriends, and you'd look out the window into the apartments, and it's all gone now. And thank God for Jackie O, because after they tore down Penn Station, which they never should have done, I can't tell you how many buildings she saved. But it's not like the way it used to be, Eddie. So there was that kind of conversation. So anyhow, Pop McKenna he would get his paycheck, he would cash it, and they would hit every bar between 42nd Street and 86th Street, every Irish bar. And he'd put my mom on the bar, she's 8 years old, and Pop McKenna would sing a song and have his pint. Okay, Molly, let's go. 3 more blocks, up back onto the bar, have a pint and sing. When they got to 86th Street, whatever money was left, say, you take half of it, take it home to your 2 older brothers. Make sure, like, they put their uniforms on and get to school, because if the nuns find out, it's back to the orphanage. All right, and they laugh about this story, or they did laugh about it, when telling it to me in 2020. But when you hear a story like that, and you have a better understanding of who your parents are, and I'll tell you stories about my father's life, which is crazy, you look at your parents very differently. It's like, oh, well, I get why you weren't the "I love you so much" mom. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, you never had an example of that. You never saw a version of what a family looked like. So the fact that they did such a great job with us is a testament to, fixing the ills of the past.
It's interesting because we're in this time where so many people are doing like 23andMe and trying to figure out what their heritage is. And your heritage is so front-facing.
Yeah.
I mean, do you feel like because you were like so staunchly Irish as a family that has shaped your personality, how you relate to the world, your relationships with people, more than if you were just using a vial and being like, oh, wow, Irish,
Yeah. I think definitely, like I said, my dad was a New York City cop. Like the cliche is like the Irish cop in New York, right? Like my mom had red hair and her father was a drunk, another cliche. Yeah, right? Check all the boxes. My father's father was a drunk, and my father used to say about our 2 grandfathers is, Pop McKenna. Pop McKenna is like, he's the happy dancing drunk who might periodically fall down the stairs. My father never laughed, never smiled, but he might throw you down the stairs. And that was the difference between who they were. Yeah. But like in my neighborhood growing up, I just recently played golf with 2 of like my childhood buddies, and it just kind of came up in conversation. I sort of forgot. But of the 4 of us, those 2 of them, both their mothers and fathers were born in Ireland. So of my 9 best friends, who in the second book, because I think it is going to be a trilogy, those families. Oh, cool, thank you. Like I grew up, like, you'd go over to your friend's house and both parents spoke with an Irish brogue and they were making Irish soda bread and the girls had to do Irish step dancing and the sons had to play the accordion. Like that was, so like there was no escaping it. And then the other half of my friends were all Italian. And, their grandparents, for the most part, were sort of off the boat. So, like, that was our world. Like, it was, it was American, but it was definitely, like, all of these sort of off-the-boat characters. So it absolutely shaped who I am, I guess, yeah.
Did you pass that down to your kids? Do they feel staunchly Irish as well?
I think so, but, it's different. It's so different now. And I think, like, we don't live in, a working-class neighborhood anymore. But I think a big part of me writing the book, especially so my mom was very sick during COVID and then sadly died. Never got to read the book. I'm not gonna cry because I almost did in another one of these. So I'm just yeah. You can hit me with a couple of questions to get me. Yeah. But anyhow, I so sort of after she died, and I'll tell you how the book kind of morphed after that. I was like, I'm gonna lean into not just her stories, but the stories of my father's family, and his grandfather plays a big role in it. Because I just started to think it was important for my kids to have some sense of, like, the world that I came from and where their grandparents, who they knew, came from, and what it was like for their great-grandparents who came to this country at the turn of the century with no money and no education. And, and then, 2 generations later, like, life is good.
So chapter 19. You talk about smells and how they can take you back to a time and place. They also your characters also visit time and place. Like they go back to places to try to recall the time as well. But smell, your character finds like his grandfather's pipe will take him back. His mother's perfume will take him back. Is there a scent that would take you back to that time?
I mean, it's so funny. My brother today just texted me, and he's what is it, like inflicted or infected with the same sort of melancholy and nostalgia. He's got an old 69 Cutlass. So in high school, I had a 70 Buick Skylark, and it's fall in New York right now. And he's just like, he said, I took the Cutlass for a ride today, and just like, the interior of that car just takes me back to your Skylark in 1986 as I'm pulling out of the driveway. Like, so it's just the smell of that, right? So I'm trying to think, is there one for me?
Like, what is that smell, though? It's like leather interior?
Yeah. It's sort of like, it's like, it's kind of damp leather.
Damp leather.
Yeah. And with a little hint of fall.
Very nice.
So yeah, or whatever. Yeah.
Okay. So of course you highlight the notion of bittersweet feelings, and of course for the last 10 years I've hosted a podcast called The Bittersweet Life. So bittersweet always jumps out to me. But how would you define what that feeling is?
Like I always get it at the end of every summer, right? At the end of every summer. We have a summer house. We live in the city, and we have a summer house on Long Island where I grew up. And the last day of summer, I'm always the one who loads up the car, right? So like I'm in the driveway loading up the car. And it's been a great summer filled with great days on the beach and barbecues and seeing all your friends and all that stuff. And it happens every time. Like I'm alone in the driveway, and that hint of fall, right? It's in the air. I'm crushed by sadness, even though I'm like, what are you so like? You're coming off of like a great summer, like life is good, like like just try to be happy here, but it's impossible.
It's always good and bad,
right?
Bittersweet.
Yeah.
All right, you are a director, an actor, a screenwriter. What is it like for you to add novelist to your description?
And it's not just because this is the most recent thing I've done, because it's not the most recent thing I've done. I made a movie this summer in Ireland, but like I am more proud of this than anything I've done. Maybe it's because of that early dream that I had, but I think it's the most fully realized thing that I've kind of created. Like anytime you sit down to write a script, I talked about like having an idea to make a movie like The 400 Blows. You have like images in your head of what that movie's going to look like, and then you start to write the script, and it just changes so much based on how much money you get, who you cast, the locations you get. The book is pretty darn close to kind of what I wanted it to look like, if you will. What I wanted it to smell like and feel like, I think like all of that comes across. I just recently listened to the audiobook. I do the narration just to kind of vibe it and see like, and also because I'm deep into the second book. So for the book tour, I wanted to make sure I wasn't talking about scenes that I had just written. I remember, now is that in the new book or is that in the old book?
I don't remember.
But I love this process so much because like I make indie films or low budget movies. So my entire career, the writing process, I've always been handcuffed by the budgets that are available to me. So when I'm writing a screenplay, a lot of times I just know we can never afford to shoot that scene. So I just rewrite the scene as a smaller version of it. I'll tell you funny stories about Brothers McMullen on how we just figured out a way to tell a story as small as you possibly can. With this, initially I thought it was going to take place, and again, when I started, I was thinking, if I publish the book, I could then adapt it into a screenplay for a film. Yeah. And that was going to be The Kid in 1980, which is an affordable movie to make. The minute I start bringing my mom's life in, like going to Babe Ruth's open casket wake at Yankee Stadium, which she actually did do, well, it's going to be a little pricey. Going back to my great-grandfather, starting his trucking business in Hell's Kitchen in 1880, a little pricey. So it was liberating. And to just write without having the producer's hat on, because when I'm writing screenplays, I also produce all those movies. So I'm like, I just have to be practical. And I was able to be impractical, I guess, with this one.
Yeah. And it's also something that you are, until it's in the hands of an editor, it's profoundly alone compared to having to work with a whole group of people.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. And I knew also, and I'll tell the story, we'll get to like the editor who really saved the book. Mm-hmm. I knew it was going to be a process to get it published, but not the same kind of process of trying to get a film financed. Mm-hmm. And then even once it's financed, you have to then sell it. And then once you sell it, you have to then try and like figure out how to get people into the theaters. Like that's such a hard, long process that I'm so glad I have this to fall back on now.
Yeah. Katy popping in real quick to take you on a little journey for a moment. Back to when Tiffany and I were exploring the streets of Rome. Take a listen.
Coincidentally, as luck would have it, we have one of Rome's very best cafes just around the corner. So let's see if it's open.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Cafe Sant'Eustachio in the piazza of the same name. And, of course, there's going to be some, super niche coffee snobs who are going to have their own particular favorite. But I would say the majority of Romans consider either this cafe or Tazza d'Oro to be the best coffee in Rome. But I do think the smell of this place is amazing. And when you walk inside, if you like the smell of coffee, it's pretty incredible. Now, you can see everybody's standing up at the counter. There are some tables outside for the tourists, but the Italians who come here, a lot of business people come here during the day on their coffee break. The parliament is just around the corner, so sometimes you'll see some famous Italian politicians in here. They always stand up at the bar to get their coffee. And as you can see, it's packed. You can't really, it's hard to get up to the front of the line. You have to elbow your way up there. But despite its fame, the coffee is very well priced. An espresso is around €1, so they have not taken advantage of their fame. Pay for what you want and then take your receipt up to the bar. And obviously don't push in front of people. You wait your turn, but people in Italy don't really make organized lines. So you just kind of look around you, see who is there before you, and when you feel like those people have been served, you put your arm forward and you get your coffee.
If I want to be legit, do I have to stand at the bar?
No. Sometimes you want to sit down and have your coffee. There's nothing wrong with that. I prefer that. I'm a tea drinker, so of course I prefer sitting down. Worse than having a pot of tea standing up at the bar of a cafe. It's it's the worst. You don't drink tea quickly. Tea is it's a total nightmare. So I usually just get water these days.
The one way you are at odds with this country. Well, let's move on to a place where you're not at odds, a place that is extremely beautiful and another. We have had so much fun exploring this historic city. So many wonderful stories, so many beautiful and thrilling sights to see, and we've made so many discoveries together. Now imagine being on the streets of Rome with us, making those discoveries for yourself, as we show you some of Rome's most delightful secrets. You see them with your own eyes. You smell the smells. We're leading a week in Rome this October, 2025, from the 5th to the 11th. A small group of adventurous and curious listeners. And you could be one of them. Find out more information at thebittersweetlife.net or email us for the details at bittersweetlifepodcast@gmail.com. Now, back to the show. Oh man, I have 1,000 more questions I could ask you. But yes, so there is a mic over here, and I have this tablet if you guys have typed it in. And if you don't have any questions, I'll just keep going.
And we can repeat your questions, right? We could probably hear
Yes, I can also repeat. Yeah, if you don't mind, because they're recording it.
That's right, my bad.
They're recording it for people who are listening at home.
Well, I feel a little bit naive because up until tonight, I thought it was a memoir. And I think one reason is because I listened to the audio. And because you were reading it, I thought it was your life. Did that ever occur to you, that you might confuse people?
Not until tonight. And it's too late to do anything about it now. So I guess, yeah. What are you going to do?
I'm curious, when you told the story about the 9 different stories becoming one story in your book,
Yep.
I started thinking of you acting in other people's movies. Are you a pain in the ass because you're thinking on 18 different levels, or can you just, is that like a little oasis for you to do somebody else's material?
The latter. It's more the oasis. I mean, I got very lucky in that, after I made my first 3 films as a writer-director, the first movie I ever acted in was Private Ryan. So I can assure you, you were not going to show up on that set and offer any suggestions. All right? But the great thing that happened from that was, Stephen was so generous with his time. I was like, would you mind if I, on some days, just kind of shadowed you to sort of like just watch your process? So for me, I got to go to graduate film school on that set for 66 days watching him. And he changed the way I work with actors. For the first 2 weeks, all of us, for the whole gang of the young guys, none of us had really been in a studio film before, and we were all terrified. And, for the first 2 weeks, Spielberg is doing like 2 to 3 takes and not giving us any kind of feedback. So we're convinced we're terrible. He has nothing to say to us because we suck, and we're going to get fired. Midway through, or towards the end of the second week, we do a scene where he asks for a 4th take. And then he starts giving us some notes. Would you try this? Would you try that? Try that. So afterwards at lunch, we said to him, hey, a bunch of us went over and said, Stephen, why today did you kind of give us some notes? And he said, well, today you didn't know what the hell you were doing. He goes, and I hired you guys for a reason. You're all kind of very specific types. I assume that you show up to a day at work, having done your homework, prepared, have choices that you're going to make. I'm not going to give you a note after the first or second take, especially young actors, which immediately would make you insecure. And even now at my age, if I get a note, not that I haven't acted for anybody in a long time, but if you do get a note, you kind of like put back on your heels and you're starting to second guess your choices. He's like, and you're an ensemble. So I got to give you guys time to for the band to kind of find the groove together, if you will, right? So I'll give you 3 takes to do that. If you can't find it, then I got to step in and kind of help you get there. And that was so eye-opening for me because I thought, when I made my first 3 films, I thought the director was supposed to direct. So after every take, I thought I was supposed to say something. And now I since then, that was we shot that in 97. That's how I direct and when I work with actors. So only when there is something to say do I step in. So really it changed my approach to making films. Then after that, no, like for me, to show up on someone else's set, I mean, not to sound like arrogant, and again, I'm not a great actor. Like I do my thing, right? I'm always amazed at what a nice, relaxing day it is compared to when you're writing, directing, acting, and producing. During that, like every second of every day is filled with somebody asking you a question or a problem that needs to be solved. When you're an actor, some days you have, like if you do an action film, you have 3 words you have to say the whole day. Let's get him over here. And then you're just fucking doing all that. I'm like, I can't, I'm getting paid for this? Fantastic. So, anyhow, thank you.
Which one of those are people most interested in when they hear that you act, you direct, you produce?
I think
what do people
acting,
zero in
depending
on?
on the movie, and then writing probably, because I find like this, the writing is something that's a little bit more relatable. Like it's hard for people to think about directing or producing. And there's a ton of writers out there. So
Yeah, I get you. Okay. Hi.
Thanks for being here.
Of course.
I was just curious on your writing process. Is like, do you do it the old-fashioned way, put stuff on paper first? Is there a time of day that you feel more creative, like morning, night? Do you have music playing? Do you need a secluded cabin or something like that? Or, maybe
I
in the closet?
don't have the cabin.
with
I
the
wish
light
I had the
off?
cabin.
Just curious on how
Yeah.
do you have writer's block and how do you get out of that?
I'll give you all that. Because I like to talk. No, so it's changed over the years, but, I would say for the last, since probably my kids were born, which is now 21 years, I try to write every day. I got that from years ago. We optioned William Kennedy, the great William Kennedy, who won the Pulitzer for Ironweed, his novel Legs. So I got to work with him adapting that book into a screenplay. Never got made. But, the same question you asked, and that was years ago, I asked about his process. And he said, I don't care what you do. Figure out a way to work every day. Even if it's 10 minutes, he goes, I try to write for at least an hour. I'll write even on Christmas Day. So I've kind of adopted that. And I quite honestly, I don't write every day, but I intend to write every day. And, like on this book tour, it's been a little hard. So I've probably written half the days I've been on this, 15-day tour. The time that I prefer to write is I try to go from 10 o'clock to 1, right? I drop my kids off at school, come back, have a little coffee, check some quick emails, turn off my Wi-Fi, go 10 to 1. So do those 3 hours. Then take a lunch break. And if I'm in a really good groove and I felt like, oh, wait, I still have more to do, I'll then pick it back up, let's say, from 3 to 5. So that would be my process. As far as writer's block goes, I've never had it because I don't allow myself to have it. If I'm writing a script and I get to a scene that I can't quite crack, I just say, the first line of dialogue I write is basically, okay, this is the shittiest version of this scene. No one is ever going to see it. Don't sweat it. Just plow through this so you can get to the scene that you know that you're excited to write. Because there's always there's chapters or passages or sequences that are more fun to work on than others. So that's what I do. But then the act of typing, I find, kind of just breaks you through. And if I equate it to if anybody here plays music or writes music. You would never sit there and go from a C to a G and freeze before the A minor or the E minor, right? And be like, oh no, I got to put it down, right? I can't do it. You'll noodle and you'll find it. Writers sometimes, if they can't come up with the next sentence or the next scene, they put it down. I'm just noodle for a half hour, and the noodling is the shitty version of the scene or the bad chapter. And then you'll find, a lot of guys, when they re-listen to the noodling that they thought was garbage, right? It's like, oh, wait, there was good stuff in there. And I find, there's good stuff in the garbage. So that's how I kind of break through the writer's block. The other way I break through the writer's block is, I'm always working on several screenplays. That's not my intention. I have the one that I really want to write. But when I hit that wall and I know I have to write that day and I don't have it, I'll be like, oh, let me just go back and pick up the cop script, let's say. It's completely different than the romantic comedy or the sad drama. Just as a way to just kind of keep doing it and move another ball down the field closer to the end zone. That's kind of how I look at it. And it's you know, there are some creative people who they don't think you can be creative that way. You know, I know the Beatles always talked about, like, they showed up at the studio like it was a 9-to-5 job, and they're just going to do their work. And I'm thinking, like, they did some pretty good shit. So I'm following them. So that's my kind of approach to it. Did that answer all of it, I think? Okay, cool.
So we always hear about authors who have, like, novels in a drawer that never come out. How many scripts do you think have never come out that you've made, if you had to estimate?
I don't have to. It's about 27.
You know exactly.
27 finished screenplay. I have 3 Westerns, which I'm going to make one of those one day. You know? Yeah, I have like a movie that is like my Godfather that I'm going to make one day. It's hard to get movies made.
It is.
And it's getting harder and harder and harder. So yeah, a lot.
Would you ever pass one of your scripts off to, like, if Steven Spielberg was like, hey, man?
If Steven Spielberg said yes, I wouldn't even have to think about that. But
if M. Night Shyamalan said, can I
mean,
have
like,
that?
it's never happened. So but I, you know, like I'm now, you know, like, not to be a fatalist or whatever, but like I'm 56, so I know it's like, you know, I still have a lot of years left to make movies, but not as many as I had when I was 36. So it's like, there's some movies where I'm like, shit, man, you got to get on that one. You know, like the Western, I don't know how I feel about, like, riding a horse, like, really fast right now. You know what I mean?
It's going to last, the hurt's going to last a little longer,
I
for
don't
sure.
know about that. Maybe I'm the guy in the rocking chair on the outside chewing tobacco, saying something funny like this.
It's quite a gift that you come and you speak, because we get to learn a lot more about you, and you obviously seem like a family man, and we know you so much from a professional perspective. But when you think about your profession, your passion, and your purpose, what is your legacy? What will you leave? What do you want to be known for?
Woo. Seattle hits big at the end.
There's a couple of quotes. There's I can't remember the filmmaker that said it, but as it related to, like, film crews, it said, when I watch a film, I need to be able to tell who the devil made it, right? So, like, I always fell in love with artists who sort of, like, they didn't jump around genres, right? You know, I mentioned William Kennedy. You know, I'm a huge Springsteen fan. You know, like, writing about similar characters and stories over and over again. So that, I know early on in my career, I wasn't interested in kind of jumping around and playing with different genres. I kind of I liked the stories that started in that house, you know. I'll tell you one little thing about the cover of the book. The cover's kind of a metaphor for the fact fiction thing in the book. So that is my face when I'm 12. That is the house I grew up in, which is also the house we shot Brothers McMullen in. But the photograph is my nephew that my daughter took this past Thanksgiving, and we photoshopped the Marlboro Road on the sign. So it's a little bit of truth and a little bit of BS. So
That's great.
yeah.
That's great. But so for your legacy.
So for my
jumping around.
legacy, yeah. Yeah, you know, I think, like, I kind of have, like, a little snapshot slice of life of characters in a time that are pretty specific. I think the book, you know, if I look at my first film and the book, and there's 30 years between them, it's clearly like I'm looking at sort of an Irish-American working class experience coming out of New York, but you know, I remember even when Brothers McMullen came out, and that movie, like, was huge. I got to travel all over the world and go to all these different film festivals, and people all over the world said, you know, that's my family. You know, so, like, there is, in specificity, you can find, like, universal truths, right? So, like, I write to a specific place, but I think, like, you know, because they're just real people dealing with real issues, I think they're very relatable. So I don't know if that quite answers it, but it's a great question. Now I'm going to have to give some thought to a better answer. Yeah.
Oh, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much
Yeah,
for
no,
coming
thank
to
you.
Seattle.
Really appreciate
Thank you,
it.
everybody,
Thank
for
you.
coming out.
Fun.
He's going to be signing over there. So get your book. Tiffany and I want to thank Town Hall Seattle for presenting Edward Burns and his book, A Kid from Marlboro Road. And thank you for allowing us to share this conversation on the Bittersweet Life. I hope you enjoyed listening, and until next time, this is the Bittersweet Life. I'm Katy Sewell. It's rare to find a podcast that has aired for over a decade, but this podcast is one, and you can be a sponsor of it, reaching a loyal group of engaged and thoughtful people who relish travel, new experiences, and lifelong learning. Get the conversation started by visiting the support tab at thebittersweetlife.net.